Welcome back. It's the second part of our discussion with Comrade Iskolat. You will recall in the first part of the discussion, we covered the history of the class struggle, principally in Latvia, but also, of course, interrelated to this in Estonia and Lithuania. We covered the revolution in Latvia immediately in the period of the Bolshevik Revolution, the crushing of that revolution by counter-revolutionary forces, including Germans, and of course the role of the British imperialists was significant in that as well. We talked about the way in which the Baltic states were run by the comprador bourgeoisies in the 1920s and 1930s, before concluding our discussion last time on the overthrow of the fascist regimes in the Baltic states and the accession of these states to the USSR. So Comrade Iskolat joins us again today. Thank you for joining me again to continue this discussion, Comrade.
And thank you for inviting me. So we left off in July and August of 1940, right after the fascist regimes were overthrown in the Baltics and the republics joined the USSR in the face of the imminent German threat. So the situation was complex because the Baltic republics, the Baltic countries, they had to rebuild their industry and their economy that suffered greatly because of the capitalist economic crises and the ongoing imperialist war that was going on. So the Germans they broke through the Ardennes forest and they captured virtually all of Western Europe. And the USSR, like I mentioned, provided ample opportunities in terms of raw materials and expertise. So a lot of agricultural machinery and fertilizers were sent to the Baltic Soviet states in order to rebuild the agriculture. And then a lot of skilled specialists were sent to rebuild the industry that was stagnating and basically limping along in the pre-war capitalist Baltic states. And yes, like you mentioned, there was a lot of sabotage because the factories, they were declared public property. They were turned over to the people. And of course, the capitalist class, so while defeated, it was not completely crushed. Some of them managed to escape to Nazi Germany and Sweden because they're basically they're next door. And many of them they went to ground. They basically went underground, and they started plotting their takeover. And one of the many things they did was to sabotage the economy in order to try and trigger public dissent, to trigger this dissatisfaction with the new Soviet government, to make it look like the Soviet government, like socialism, cannot work in the Baltic states, that only this petty bourgeois way of doing things can work. And of course, a lot of these nationalist organizations, even before the war, they were closely tied to the Nazis. And after their overthrow, they started actively engaging with the Nazi leadership and the Nazi intelligence. For example, these organizations like the Pērkona Krus, the Hawks of Daugava, the Falcons of Daugava, the Falcons of the Fatherland, all of these ultranationalist and fascist organizations, it's basically the same thing. All these bourgeois reactionaries, they started collaborating with the Germans. So they started giving them intel. Many of them traveled to East Prussia to get their training for ideological subversion, and of course sabotage and all kinds of armed activity that would be necessary for the fascist invaders, because they needed a very organized base of operations, because they needed those who knew the land, those who had local contacts, those who could run the collaborator, the occupation administration. And there were a lot of such organizations and people. Yeah, I've written down a lot of these names and organizations. And these nationalists were directly recruited by the Abwehr. the Nazi military intelligence. For example, one of the most prominent ones was Turks, and he was assigned to the Abwehrkommando Unit 204 in order to run these clandestine nationalist operations. And a lot of these Nazi and fascist chiefs in Latvia, they were also recruited. For example, Gustav Stelmiņš, Edmunds Puksis, and various generals and colonels of the interwar Latvian army, like Colonel Plēksners, Silgailis, Taupis, Mēliņš, etc. And many of them would receive high-ranking positions in the occupation regime of Ostland that would be established in June. The nationalists, they were already told a week or two in advance exactly when the German invasion would take place. So by June 15th, most of them were in the know about that, and they're already staging a fascist coup. And on June 22nd, 1941, the fascist armies invaded the Soviet Union. They had several advantages, and that explains why the Soviet Union had to retreat, why they had to sacrifice some of the land for time, because first of all, the fascists had the element of surprise. The Soviet government knew they would attack, but they did not know exactly when. They knew it would take place in the summer, but they did not know the exact date. And another thing was the overwhelming force that was localized on key sectors of the front. The Nazis invaded with more than 250 divisions. So we have the fascist armies of both Germany and its satellite and puppet states. So in total, if you count all these auxiliary and rear units, more than 5 million people were part of the invasion force. And since the collaborators already started staging uprisings in many parts of the Baltic states, the authorities of Soviet Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they made the decision to evacuate as many people as they could and form all these labor battalions that would fight the Nazis. So many militia units were formed from the workers from the factories, from collective farms, in order to stall the Nazi advance and allow the Soviet army to retreat and regroup. And a lot of fighting took place near Liepāja. This is a major harbor city, a major port town, and the Nazis immediately invaded from Prussia, and the city managed to hold on for more than a week in order to tie up as many Nazi units as they could. A lot of the workers' battalions and communist youth members, they managed to orderly retreat, and many of them managed to successfully go underground and avoid capture by the Nazis. And in the Baltic states in particular, the Great Patriotic War was extremely destructive. Not only because of the Holocaust and the massacres that took place, but also the sheer scope of economic damage that was brought by the fascist Germany. So they considered the Baltics as their eastern territory that was rightfully German. So this notion of the Crusaders claiming this land for the so-called civilized Europeans, it was extremely amplified in fascist Germany. And one of the key ideologues was Alfred Rosenberg, the Baltic German who was born in Tallinn, modern-day Estonia. And he was one of the major architects of the Holocaust and the so-called Drang nach Osten policy and the General Plan Ost, which means that all of the inhabitants that lived in the Soviet Union, in the European part of the Soviet Union, they would be either killed or expelled, and the area would be settled by the Germans. And immediately, the occupation administration was set up, and by the start of July, the Nazis managed to take over Riga, and by the end of July, all of the Baltic republics were taken over. They immediately set up the occupation administration, the so-called Ostland administration, which literally means the eastern provinces, the eastern lands. and the head office was located in Riga. So the Nazi brass, all of these fascist collaborators, and all of the important figures, they were in Riga. And the Soviet government immediately set up various partisan brigades and partisan battalions in order to resist the fascists and to disrupt the fascist war economy. That is, blow up railways, destroy ammunition depots, assassinate key figures, wage a relentless propaganda campaign along the local populace. And immediately after the fascist takeover, horrific massacres took place. The local collaborators immediately started rounding up everybody they suspected of sympathizing or aiding the Soviet government, and horrific massacres immediately took place that are very similar to the ones that took place in Belarus and Ukraine, like the Babi Yar massacre. And today is actually the anniversary of the Rumbala massacre, where 30,000 Jews, communists, Roma people, and disabled people, they were rounded up. They were sent to the Rumbala forest to dig their own graves, and they were all executed in these death pits. Another 15 to 20,000 were killed in the Biterniki forest, right next to Riga, and around 15,000 people were killed in the newly established Riga ghetto, and several concentration camps were established in and around Riga, namely the Salaspils death camp, the Mežaparks concentration camp, and smaller concentration camps in Daugavpils and Biterniki, where people were worked to death, and diseases and hunger ran rampant. It was so bad that a lot of the prisoners were not given food at all, or were given 100 grams of bread or less per day. There was no treatment for disease, and a lot of people simply died on the spot. And anyone who couldn't work any longer, they were immediately killed. And a lot of the guards, a lot of the camp administration was recruited from local collaborators. And in total, because of the fascist invasion, because of this relentless extermination campaign, in total, Latvia alone lost roughly 600,000 people. And a lot of people were brought from other European and Soviet countries, and they were killed there. They were put into camps. A lot of the POWs, a lot of the European Jews, and most of them were killed. Latvia also had a very vibrant Jewish community. More than 75,000 Jews lived in Latvia before the war, and virtually all of them were exterminated. By the end of the war, roughly 1,000 Jews remained in Latvia.
Just to interject for a moment, comrade, just to give this a broader context here. You mentioned like the Eastern Plan that the Nazis had, and the basis of this plan was to, as you say, remove all the non-Germanic races from the European Soviet Union and Russia, and to replace them with German settlers. And the only ones that would be allowed to stay would be those who were essentially slaves, who would be used as slave labor by the German capitalists and landlords. And the only other section who would be allowed to persist would be a small number of collaborators, comprador bourgeoisie, and some armed thugs who would work for them. Is that a correct summary of where things were going?
Yes, totally correct. And this collaborator caste would be Germanized as well later, after the supposed German victory. And right now, the so-called historians in the Baltics and this nationalist lobby in NATO and EU countries, they're trying to paint the fascist invasion as some sort of liberation or deoccupation, even though the fascists themselves, the German overlords, they did not hide their contempt for the local collaborator forces, and they made it extremely clear that they would not tolerate any self-determination, even the tiniest bit of this autonomy or municipality in the Baltic states, and they started relaxing this policy only after a string of crushing defeats at the hands of the Red Workers and Peasants Army. Only when the fascists realized their inevitable defeat, only then they started giving concessions, and then they started spreading this talk of securing the Baltic independence, and that is how this myth of the so-called Baltic fight against the Nazis and the Soviets originated, even though these so-called freedom fighters, they are Nazi collaborators because they were armed by the Germans, they were trained by the Germans, they had contacts with the German intelligence and the German high command, and they also were ideologically aligned completely because right after the fascists invaded, they immediately reprivatized all of the public property, all of the public land, and they gave them to the same capitalists on the condition that they recognized the German supremacy. So unless you were a willing collaborator, you were not getting all this private property back. So all of these Nazi thugs that are presented as heroes, they voluntarily collaborated with the Nazis. Either they allow them to roam free, or they actively help them by joining these death squads, by waging all these propaganda campaigns, by working in the Nazi occupation administration.
So, just to emphasize this point, these comprador elements who willingly joined with the Nazis did so in order to seize back property that had been taken from them and which had been nationalized or collectivized in the socialist period immediately before the Nazi invasion. And all of their talk about nationalism and preserving Baltic cultural identities is all basically a load of garbage, because they were prepared to see all of the national identity of the Baltic states completely swept away by the Germans in return for hanging on to their property. Is that a correct summary?
Yes, exactly. And the fascist invaders, they immediately started erasing all of the local culture. So first of all, one of their first steps was to outlaw any other language other than German. So German would be used for everyday matters, for official administrative purposes, and education. So all other languages, the Baltic languages, the Estonian language, the Russian language, everything else would be completely banned. And then the fascist invaders, they disbanded and closed all of the universities and colleges in the Baltics. So the higher education was reserved only for the German overlords. So the ethnic Germans and members of this newly found occupation administration. So in major cities like Vilnius, Riga, Kaunas, Daugavpils, ghettos were opened up, and all of the Jewish people, Roma people, the disabled, they were immediately placed into these tiny ghettos. So in Riga ghetto alone, more than 50,000 Jews were relocated there, including those that were sent from Germany and Austria. And in total, 38,000 were killed, and the rest were moved to the Salaspils extermination camp in 1943, when the tide turned definitively against Germany. So, like I mentioned, the lands and factories were handed over to the local bourgeoisie and the German monopolies. And in total, the Latvian Extraordinary Military Commission established that the total amount of damages dealt to Latvia exceeded 20 billion rubles. And more than 5,700 factories were destroyed. And in total, almost 50,000 dwellings and houses were destroyed as well. The fascist occupation regime installed a very brutal exploitation regimen with 14 to 16-hour work shifts. So the exploitation was truly unimaginable, because the crop yield was immediately reduced by half, by more than 650,000 hectares, because they didn't plant anything else in return. And all of the valuables that they could find, so the valuable factory equipment, it was sent to Germany. And the local economy was immediately readapted to supply exclusively the German invasion forces, and anything else that was left, only the leftovers were handed over to the population of the Baltics, which was not much.
So just to return to the language question for a moment, comrade. The German policy was the complete suppression of Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian, and also to the exclusion of the great majority, or in fact all, of the local population from obtaining anything other than the most basic level of education. Can we just do a quick comparison here? What was the status given under socialism to Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian languages, and what was the approach taken later in the socialist period to the national cultures of the free Baltic republics? If you can just do a quick comparison there.
Yeah, of course. Like in the first socialist republic, established in 1919, and the same policy was applied in the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1940, and after the war, that the Latvian language was given the same equal status as any other language in the Soviet Union. It was broadly supported, so the higher education was supported in both the Latvian language and the Russian language, and some foreign languages were also available. And the government provided very generous funding to book publishing, to magazine publishing, to culture, and to science. So all of these smaller local languages, they were given a lot of breathing room. So the aspiring authors, they were immediately put into contact with publishers, and they could get their works published in very, very great volumes. So, for example, in the first year of the Soviet government in 1940, several million books and magazines were published in the first year. So all book publishing it also became public. And a lot of these authors who were persecuted, for example, in the 1920s and 1930s, and this means the vast majority of novelists and poets in Latvia, such as Vilis, Lācis, and Andrejs Upīts. They were published in the interwar republic as well, but they were heavily censored, and the amount of books published was not really large. I have some pre-war editions of their books, and the volumes published did not exceed 3,000 copies. So it was not a lot, even for such a tiny country like Latvia. But with the establishment of the Soviet government, the published volumes, they immediately skyrocketed. So I compared this to the Soviet editions. I see 50,000 copies, 70,000, more than 100,000 copies. And for such a small country, this was an enormous volume. And all of these printed materials, magazines and books, they became very, very cheap. So it costs, for example, 3 rubles, which in modern terms is just a fraction. It's just a fraction of a pound or a euro. So it did not cost much. And all of these extracurricular activities, all of these literature classes, they were funded and supported by the Soviet government. And a lot of these books written by the Latvian authors, including the most popular one, Vilis, Lācis, they were translated into dozens of languages inside and outside the Soviet Union. For example, thanks to this Soviet policy, Vilis, Lācis, who wrote all of these historical pieces about the most turbulent periods of Latvian history in the 19th and 20th century, he was published in more than 50 languages worldwide by the Soviet Union. So before that, he was virtually unknown outside of Latvia. But thanks to the progress made by socialism, by people's power, all of these offers from smaller Soviet republics, from all of these autonomous republics, for example, from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, from the Far East, a lot of them suddenly became widely known. And a lot of these people are still highly regarded today. And a lot of people heard about them. And thanks to the Soviet policy of cultural expansion, and Cultural Revolution, a lot of the Russian offers from Central Asia and other parts of the Soviet Union, they became known in Latvia. For example, the great Russian poets like Alexander Pushkin, Lermontov, and, for example, philosophers like Griboyedov, Dobrolyubov, Chernyshevsky, they were published in Latvia, and they became widely known. So people could already read all of these works translated.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make there, and I want to just emphasize the main message from this section of the interview regarding language and culture, because it's been a long-standing charge of the current Baltic compradors. I'll just give them their appropriate title there. That they represent like the restoration of real Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian culture, and that this culture and these cultures and languages have been suppressed by the Soviets for years. And the same charge is made by their equivalents in Ukraine, their equivalents in Belarus. But the actual truth, as you've just been saying, is that far from being suppressed, these cultures and languages were given a much better developed framework to operate in, and actually artists from these nations received a much greater and wider recognition of their work than they would ever have done in the capitalist period. And so the charge is that these reactionary bourgeois nationalists and compradors make regarding the culture in the Soviet period, it is literally all a lie. It is literally the opposite of what they said, that they say is the case with regard to language and culture in the Soviet period.
Exactly. They're just basically they're reapplying these psychopath strategies in order to paint themselves as these victims who didn't do anything wrong, who did not do this first. It was done to them, that they were victimized, that they were brutalized. So the psychologists, they use this term DARVO, so denial, aggression, reverse victim, and I don't remember the last word. So basically, this is the strategy that the bourgeoisie uses, because bourgeoisie, they essentially, it's it's basically institutionalized psychopathy. It's this sort of mental illness, this aggression, this self-destructive behavior that is applied to the entire country. So they're spreading this behavior, and many of them truly believe that they are actually the victims, and they're just trying to make this as vague and ethereal as possible, because they're trying to get rid of all this context. They try to get rid of all these details, and most importantly, they try to get rid of this class nuance that exists, that actually the Soviet Union represented the working people, the honest working people, and the small and middle peasantry. And
Mm.
that the nationalism, uh, it is the complete domination of the local and foreign bourgeoisie. They're trying to hide the fact that they are actually the exploiters, that they exploit the people, that they're sucking their blood dry, that they are the ones who invite foreign occupations, that they invite foreign aggression, and they sell the country out for a penny to all these foreign monopolies. They are trying to hide that fact, and they're trying to paint themselves as the sole capable representatives of the people. So they're trying to present these Baltic states, as the only place where a Latvian language can exist. So they're trying to victimize you at every turn. And what we need to do is to reject these advances and reject these accusations, because as soon as you start playing by their rules, they've already won, because they're just using the same Goebbels playbook. You just repeat the lie 1,000 times, and then it is perceived as the truth. You must not give them even an inch. So you must rebuke them at every turn, because only then you can regain ground, and you can convince the workers in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in Poland, and Russia, and elsewhere, that the defeat of the bourgeoisie is the only way to save the country from destruction, to save it from more imperialist conflicts, to save it from wars, to save it from starvation, from hypermortality, to save the country from dying out. Because if you look at the current demographic situation in the Baltics, it is horrific, because we've lost more than a third of our population since 1991. And the defeat of the bourgeoisie, the necessity of defeating the bourgeoisie, it is literally a matter of life and death for such small countries. Because if this goes on for a few decades, or if another imperialist-sponsored conflict flares up, then I'm not even sure if the Baltic people can survive this, because capitalism, it is death. It is the manifestation of death, and by defeating them, it is the only way to save the people. So that is why, for example, many Soviet partisans, they named themselves so death to death, for example. So capitalism is death, and we must rebuke this notion that capitalists are the victims. They are not. They are not, and they are the real oppressors. So I think we should get back to the topic. So the World War II, the latter half, and the post-war reconstruction.
Yes, I wanted to just to bring us back to the Great Patriotic War. If you could talk a little bit about the war in the Baltic states, and also there was a lot of resistance in the Baltic states. There was an awful lot of underground activity by the partisans there, and an awful lot of brutal criminality engaged in by the German occupiers to try and suppress that as well. So if you could start talking about that and take us forward into like the latter half of the Great Patriotic War.
Yes, so already in early 1942, several partisan brigades were founded in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and they were especially active in Latvia, because Latvia is mostly covered in forests, and the eastern part of Latvia, the region of Latgalia, it is right next to Belarus and Russia. So there's this junction that is called the Kurgan of Friendship, and this is the place where many partisan bases were set up, because you could easily get in contact with the Russian and Belarusian partisans. The forests were very thick, so it was easier to cross the front line. And overall, this place was in perfect position, because it was not really far from Riga. It wasn't really far from Vilnius, and wasn't very far from Estonia. So it became this junction, this beating heart of the Soviet partisan movement that bravely fought against the Nazis. But in many major cities too, underground and partisan squads formed. For example, in Riga, which was basically the toughest city to operate in, because you had the Austrian leadership there, you had a lot of German police presence there. So even in Riga, several partisan squads formed, the most prominent of which was headed by Jem Bankovic and Arvid Rentnieks. So what they did was they sabotaged factories, they blew up factories, they spread the Soviet messages, the communist messages to the people, the invitation, a call to arms to fight against the invaders. They reprinted the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and many other communist leaders. They also smuggled and took the typewriting machines, because all of them were immediately seized by the Germans. And all of these typewriters, they were stamped with a number so that the Germans could track them. So what the partisans did, they stole those typewriters, they removed those serial numbers, and they used them in order to publish manifests, to publish all of these important messages, and they sent them to other partisan squads in need. So they immediately established all the publishing process for the booklets and brochures. And in the countryside in Latgala, there were many partisan brigades that numbered thousands of people that were led by Imants Sudmalis, Sureja, by Urbans, Otomārs Oškalns, Paldiņš, Pēters, and Vilis Samsons. So by 1943, three full partisan brigades were already established. And in total, throughout the war, more than 30,000 fascist soldiers and paramilitaries were killed by the Soviet partisans. And they also successfully sabotaged hundreds of trains. So they derailed hundreds of trains. They blew up ammunition depots. They blew up military factories, and they disrupted wartime logistics so that the fascists couldn't get their supplies to the front. And this was also a very important factor in why the Soviet people, the socialist country, succeeded. Because, for example, in Belarus, at any given time, more than a third of the country was controlled by the partisans. And a lot of high-ranking officials and generals of the fascist war machine were killed. And in fact, the first ever assassination of a German general, it took place in Latvia in late 1941. So that is why the nationalists tried to downplay the successes of the Soviet partisan movement in order to make it look that the Latvian people did not support the Soviet country, did not support socialism. So basically, again, they're just trying to lie at every turn, and they're trying to omit the most important bits of information. And if you look at history, the fight that the Latvian people put up against the fascists, it completely destroys this nationalist lie. And on the front lines too, in 1942, the Latvian Rifleman Division was immediately established, and it was formed from all these people who managed to evacuate the country, and a lot of the Latvians who have been living in Siberia for generations. A lot of these people also joined voluntarily. And more than 80% of the division, it consisted of volunteers. And a lot of Latvian and Baltic Jewish people joined as well when the news of the Holocaust broke, when it reached the rest of the Soviet Union. And the Latvian division, it also played a very important role in the defense of Moscow, because it defended the railway junction of Staraya Rusa and Velikie Luki. These are very important train junctions not far from Moscow. So they defended Moscow in the harsh winter of 1941-42 and participated in many battles, including the liberation of Latvia proper. And for the defense of Moscow, the Latvian division was awarded the title of the Guard Division. So they became elite shock troopers. So again, you can see this revolutionary lineage that the Latvian people have from the late 19th century to 1905 to the October Revolution, and again in the Great Patriotic Class War, that the Latvian people always stood together with other people of the Soviet Union and with the Russian people, especially throughout history.
Yes, and just to focus on a detail for a moment, can you explain the terminology you refer to the Great Patriotic Class War? Now, I understand your meaning there, but is that a term that's commonly used in former Soviet states, or is that just a term you're using? Because I think it does have a good deal of explanatory power, that term.
So yeah, this term was introduced by a Russian comrades about 20 years ago, especially by my good comrade, Ruslan Kablakov, who also deals a lot with the war history and history of the class struggle. And it is a very good adoption because we're trying to spread it elsewhere. And we've actually noticed that it is becoming more common. Some people do not exactly refer to it as the Great Patriotic Class War, but for example, in their texts and their messages, they more and more often refer to the class aspect of the war, because this is the key piece of the puzzle, because you need to look at this conflict as a class conflict. So the bourgeoisie, the capitalist imperialists, they were not successful in strangling the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s. They tried everything they could, but they could not do it with diversion, with a coup, or anything of the like. So in desperation, they turned to fascism, and they unleashed an open class warfare. Because if you look at the class policies of the fascist invaders, you will see that it perfectly aligns with the interests of capitalism. So massive privatization, the massive expansion of private property, protection of foreign monopolies, establishment of these colonies in Eastern Europe, total exploitation of the people, this savage suppression of all cultures and all of these ethnicities, eradication of the people. And you'll see that it perfectly aligns with the with the nature of this class conflict.
And I think it's just worth emphasizing as well that the fact that the Soviet peoples fought so hard and fought so long and were willing to sacrifice so much was down I think to a great degree to the class nature of the Soviet state at that time, being a workers' state, being a genuine multinational workers' state, and with workers and peasants knowing that it was their contribution and they were the decisive factor in making the building of socialism a success throughout the 1930s, and knowing that it was really and genuinely their state that was theirs to defend and their responsibility to defend, that gave them a much greater fighting spirit than would have been the case had the old Tsarist empire still existed, or had any other form of class rule existed. Whereas if you compare that to the way in which the war went on the Western Front, which is that as soon as the Nazis walked into France, after a few weeks of fighting, there was a fascist coup in France, and then the French fascists, capitulated and turned over the whole country to the Nazis, willingly, in order that the French bourgeois could then focus on annihilating the communists and annihilating working class organization. And that's the difference, I think, in one of the big differences in understanding this war, where the proletariat and peasantry were in power. They were almost in the end undefeatable. Where the bourgeois was in power, they immediately surrendered and collaborated with the Nazis.
That is very true, and you can see the difference before and after the start of the Great Patriotic Class War. That the example of the Soviet resilience and the fact that the Soviet people fought for the truly popular government, the country that truly represented the working class and the small, honest peasantry. That people were fighting not for the capitals and the fortunes of the bourgeoisie. That they were fighting exactly as you said for their land. They fought truly for their livelihood, and their example. It not also prevented the bourgeoisie of the United Kingdom, the British Empire and the United States from striking a deal with the Hitlerites, but it also inspired the people, the soldiers in these countries. For example, the British soldiers, the French resistance, the American soldiers, especially the black soldiers, they were inspired by his example, that they were fighting for equality, that they were fighting to destroy fascism, to destroy injustices, to destroy the reign of private property. And it was a huge revolutionary potential, which paved the road to victory against fascism, and dealt a very severe blow to capitalism as a whole.
Yes, and the victory in the, I'm going to use your term, the Great Patriotic Class War, because I think it's one that we should popularize in the West as well. The victory in that war comes in the end, of course, at great cost, but it comes with the annihilation of the invading Nazi forces and the local collaborators. So with the turning point in the wars really coming in at the defense of Moscow, the victory at Stalingrad, and then later on the final nail in the Nazi coffin, if you want to put it that way, which is, of course, the defeat at the Battle of Kursk. So can you talk about this latter period of the war when we come up to the liberation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Red Army, and if we can then go from there into the period afterwards, where of course you have the reestablishment of Soviet rule in the Baltic states, but you also have underground a fascist terror organization, which, much like in Ukraine, comes to be sponsored by certainly the British and the United States as well. So we move to talk about that period then?
Yes, and one important thing that I need to stress is that the Baltic republics, the Baltic countries, they were liberated the last because, like I said, it was not only the psychological effect that the German invaders considered this land to be theirs, and it also held a very important strategic value because the Baltics have a lot of ice-free ports, and it was a very important transport junction, and it was basically the gateway to Leningrad, because one of the reasons why the fascists made so many gains was because they were aided by the local bourgeoisie. They were also aided by traders that were still left in the Red Army in order to encircle and in an attempt to encircle and capture Leningrad, the birthplace of the October Revolution. And because of these factors, both strategic, material, and psychological, the fascist invaders tried to hold on for as long as possible in the Baltics. So they tried to hold on to it for as long as possible. And the liberation of the Baltics, it became only in the summer of 1944 during the Operation Bagration. And before that, after the crushing defeats in Stalingrad and Kursk, the Nazis immediately started giving more leeway to the local Nazi collaborators because they understood that it was not possible to defeat the Soviet Union anymore, and they tried to slow this advance as much as they could. And they immediately started arming the local collaborator forces and training them in clandestine warfare in order to create this sort of thorn in the Soviet Union side, so that they could use the local collaborators as this expendable war material. It could be used to slow them down as much as possible, to grind them down. And that is why they invested so much into the Baltic bourgeoisie, because they realized that the bourgeoisie had the strongest positions there in the Baltics. And the Germans, they managed to use that to full effect. And one of the mistakes that the Soviet Union made, it did not allocate enough forces to the north, and because of that, the liberation of the Baltics came very late in the war. So in the summer of 44, Operation Bagration commenced, and the fascist army group center, it was practically destroyed in Belarus. They started pulling back, and the army group north, which was stationed in the Baltics and near Leningrad, they were ordered to retreat. And the Soviet shock forces, they attempted to cut them off west of Riga in order to prevent their escape and to destroy the army group north. But unfortunately, the Soviet forces were too stretched out, and the army group north managed to get to Courland, which is the westernmost part of Latvia, and they reestablished themselves there. And they established very, very dense fortified positions. And this place later became known as the Courland Pocket. And sadly, the Red Army was not able to fully break it until after the war, when they surrendered. And there were a lot of forces in this fascist pocket. At the start, there were 400,000 men in that place. So the front density was very, very large. So for every 5 kilometers, there was a division of 10 to 15,000 men. So you can imagine the front density. And the total length of the front was only about 150 kilometers. So yes, you had almost 500,000 men in there. And by the end of the war, roughly 150, 200,000 fascist troops were left in the Courland pocket. And the Red Army could not make significant progress. And the invaders used that time. They used these resources that they still had available in Courland to tie up as many Soviet forces as they could to draw their attention away from East Prussia, from Poland, and ultimately from Berlin in itself. And they also used this time in order to arm and prepare all of these nationalist formations that would later terrorize the Baltic countries. So they created huge ammunition depots. The largest one was located in Šiauliai, which is a Lithuanian town not far from the Latvian border. All these weapons were transported to smaller towns, and then from these smaller towns, they transported these weapon caches into these hidden locations in the forests, in the swamps, in order for the trained collaborator groups to use later. And the German military intelligence immediately trained a lot of these collaborator forces in order to wage underground warfare, in order to sabotage the Soviet war effort as soon as they could. Likewise, the Red partisans, the Soviet partisans, also tried to sabotage the German defense as much as they could in the Courland pocket. And in response to that, the fascists organized several bloody massacres and reprisals against the locals, against the local people who helped the partisans. And the most infamous massacre is the Lācis massacre. Lācis is a small village, used to be a small village in Courland. And after a fascist squad was destroyed by the partisans, the German high command in Courland, they simply drew a circle around this village, and they simply said to the Latvian SS, kill everything within this radius. And so the Latvian SS did. And dozens of people were killed, dozens of innocents, and there's still a large memorial present in there. And I should also talk in detail about the Latvian SS. So at first, like I mentioned, the Germans had absolutely no intention of creating full-fledged Baltic military units. But the crushing defeats in Stalingrad and Kursk convinced them otherwise. So they started arming these local extermination battalions, and they reformed them into the SS divisions. So Estonia had one SS division, Latvia had two, and Lithuania did not have divisions. It had several brigades that were also formed from these fascist death squads. And they were also trained in both frontline warfare and clandestine warfare. So they were also preparing for the insurgency. And by September and October of 1944, Riga was liberated during the Riga Offensive strategic operation. And Riga became the last Soviet capital to be liberated. First, in June 25th, Vilnius was liberated. In September, Tallinn was liberated, and all of Estonia. And only on October 13th, Riga was liberated. And the Courland pocket, unfortunately, persisted until the end of May 1945. The vast majority of the fascist forces, they surrendered, roughly 200,000 men, but several thousands of them, they went to ground and they started waging a brutal campaign of terror against the socialist government and against the Latvian people.
Right. So the switch in tactics occurs here when the Nazis are obviously losing the war. They move to training and arming, essentially stay behind terror networks that will be unleashed after the formal end of hostilities. So after the victory in the war, and after things have come to a close, you have the rebuilding process inside the Soviet Union, inside the Baltic states. But at the same time, and for quite some time afterwards, same as in the case of Ukraine, I think, in the case of Ukraine, the insurgency, the fascist insurgency run by the Banderas forces there, lasted for 7 years after the end of World War II. And was it a similar length of time that the fascist insurgency carried on in the Baltic states?
Yeah, it was very similar because the imperialists, they pursued roughly the same goals. So they wanted to fracture the Soviet Brotherhood. They wanted to pit several ethnicities against one another, and they just wanted to create this overall instability, this sort of chaos, to try and trick the people into believing that the Soviet government was ineffective, that it could not rebuild the economy, that the socialist economy could not be implemented in West Ukraine, in the Baltics, that only the petty bourgeois, small farmer style of doing things was viable. So uh, in 1945, there were dozens of nationalist gangs that were operating in the Baltics, big and small. The biggest ones had nearly 1,000 people operating in them. And the Soviet government immediately began the counterinsurgency efforts in order to destroy this wave of fascist terror, because they did everything they could. I mean, the fascists. So they attacked collective farms. They attacked state farms. They burned down farms. They attacked local administrative and official buildings. They killed party workers. They killed teachers, postmen, delivery drivers, store clerks, yeah, everything they could find. And they were killing entire families. So if a family joined a collective farm or a state farm, the fascists immediately marked them for death, and not even infants were spared. And the youngest victim of this post-war fascist terror was only 2 months old. And yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to say, if this is sounding familiar to listeners, this is the same selection of tactics that the British used in Malaya to destroy the communists there. It's the same tactics that were ultimately deployed in Indonesia to devastating effect by the Suharto regime when it came to power through a American-backed coup in 1965. And it's also the same tactics that the US was using against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the 1980s as well. So the same tactics are used over and over again because, again, it's the same class forces at work. Just because some of them might speak Latvian, or some of them might speak Ukrainian, or some of them are Indonesian, or some of them speak Spanish, it's always the same tactics because it's always the same kind of people doing the planning, and it's the same class interests being advanced. The reactionary bourgeoisie, local compradors sponsored by imperialism. And so the tactics are always those of pure terror, which are designed to break the will and the fighting and the will to fight of the proletariat and the peasantry in the affected area.
Exactly, because you should never be confused or tricked by the language. Because, as they say, a worker who's living on the other side of the world is much closer to me than a capitalist who speaks the same language as me. Because these are, like you said, are the class forces at work. So the Nazis created a lot of these nationalist fronts in order to act as the insurgency and propaganda outfits that were working against the Soviet government, against the Soviet country. And by the end of the war, the Germans, the imperialists, were really desperate. So instead of directly forming all of these fascist outfits that were later used against socialism, they also created several democratic fronts that were not so obvious. They were not so directly connected to the fascist power structure. And after the war, they were taken over by the imperialist intelligence agencies of the British Empire and the United States. The most prominent of which is the so-called Latvian Central Council, that was formed mostly out of pre-war nationalists and members of the pre-war nationalist government. That they positioned themselves as a force that fights both against the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But in fact, they were all Nazi agents because the Nazis did not bother them. None of them were arrested before 1944. They were not really visible until then. And when the situation in 44 truly became desperate for the Germans, all of these fronts immediately sprung up, and they were put into action. Some of these members of these nationalist fronts, they were arrested by the Germans because they stepped out of line. They demanded too much. They demanded for the Latvian independence, the same kind of independence that existed in the 1920s and 1930s. And some of them were put into concentration camps like Stuttgart, which is located in Poland. But the thing is that these prisoners were not even really prisoners. They were called honorary guests of the concentration camp because the Germans used this tactic in order to coerce all of these nationalist elements to cooperate with the fascists, and they were released if they agreed. The same tactic was used for recruiting the Ukrainian nationalists, and the most famous example, or rather infamous, is Bandera himself. He was also an honorary prisoner at the Sachsenhausen camp. And the thing is, if you were a regular prisoner, if you were a real prisoner at these concentration camps, you did not survive for more than 1 month. But these honorary prisoners, they stayed there for months and they enjoyed all the luxuries that you could imagine. So they couldn't walk out of camp. It was basically a house arrest, but they received everything. They received fresh clothing. They received ample food supplies that were luxurious compared to other camp inmates. They received fresh newspapers and magazines to update themselves on the news. They received cigarette shipments. They received liquor. So then they were released, and this internment at the concentration camp was used as a believable cover story to plant agents and to create insurgencies, because a lot of these nationalists, they were planted back into the civilian life. They were planted into these strategic factories, farms, and places of authority. And their legend, their sob story about being a concentration camp inmate, it was used to trick the people into trusting them. So that's how the Nazis, by the end of the war, that's how they did this. So they had a very, very wide and very developed network of agents and insurgents, which was later taken over by the British and American and Swedish intelligence agencies.
So the Nazis had a plan for the post-war period, even if in the event of their defeat, and this was adopted by the British and the US imperialists with the assistance of the Swedish, which will come as a surprise to any listener who doesn't understand the true role of the Nordic ruling classes in the Cold War period, which were as relentless collaborators with imperialism. So the Swedish move recently to join NATO is not a surprise if you consider the real history of the Swedish ruling class. But to look then at the post-war period, you have this difficult counterinsurgency to fight. But let's move to talk about the rebuilding of the Baltic states immediately after the victory in the Great Patriotic Class War, to use your term, and how socialism helped to rebuild the Baltic states. So can we talk a little bit about that and some of the successes from this period?
Yeah, of course. I will end the topic on the insurgency. So the Soviet government managed to develop successful tactics for destroying the insurgency. They deployed mobile NKVD and NKGB groups that managed to infiltrate these nationalist armies and cripple them from within. And these smaller Nazi hunter groups, they managed to protect the farms and key objects from fascist attacks. And by 1946-47, the tide began to turn. And a lot of the prominent nationalist ringleaders, they were killed. And the Soviet government also offered conditional amnesty. So the nationalist bandits needed to surrender before a certain date on the condition that they did not commit any serious crimes like murder, pillaging, robbery, etc., and they would be home free. So the Soviet government kept their word, and those people that surrendered, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people, they were left alone. They could reintegrate into the civilian life, and they were not hurt. And this convinced a lot of the nationalist ringleaders to surrender. but the nationalist infrastructure still persisted. And in 1949, all of these nationalist contacts, like the clergymen, the former kulaks, the spies and government agencies, they were all arrested, and they were sent to prison, to the prison camp in Siberia, because at this point it was getting desperate because the attacks continued. And if you read the memoirs written by the people who lived in the time period, they will say that 1949 was the first year when they stopped shooting in Riga. It was this bad that there were shootouts in Riga happening all the time. And like I said, the nationalists had a very extensive network in churches. The clergymen provided food, provided shelter, and used their status as a religious institution to drive away suspicion and searches.
So, just to clarify a point here, because this gets brought up quite a lot by anti-communists in the West, and also anti-communists in the former Soviet Union. The role of the organized Christian churches throughout the 20th century, in fact, and down to this day, has been, despite many local priests and Christians coming over to support socialism, the role of the church hierarchy, whether that is in the Catholic Church in Europe, whether that is the Protestant churches in Britain, whether that is the Eastern Orthodox Church, the role of the church hierarchy is tied to their status as, usually large landowners, large controllers of large tracts of land, controllers of property, and also in terms of their ideological outlook, being thoroughly bourgeois. Their psychology is thoroughly bourgeois. So when you get these sort of hysterical ravings about the anti-Christian activities of the communists, what you will find that this comes back to is the fact that the church hierarchy is nearly always, in fact almost exclusively, not only on the side of counter-revolution, but actively assist the fascist terrorism in socialist countries, and then hide behind the Bible and tradition and other ideological shields, shall we say, to justify their actions or to try and pretend that they're not doing it. But they are a vital and integral part of fascist terror after 1945.
Yes, especially in Lithuania and Poland, where the Catholic Church dominates. And as you're familiar with John Paul II, the imperialists used him to great effect in order to destabilize socialism in Poland and Lithuania.
Yes, that is correct. And just to drive the point home here, you also get this a lot from Russian reactionaries these days, who talk a lot about the sacredness of the Orthodox Church, whereas in actual fact, the Orthodox Church hierarchy remained viciously anti-communist, even though they did various bargains with the Soviet leadership, and to this day are a bastion of reaction wherever they are. This hasn't changed in many years. The attempt by, and this is just my personal opinion, some people to try and combine communism with various versions of Christianity is doomed to failure, because the various Christian churches are tied by class interests, and as you say, the psychology derived from that, to the most bitter forms of reaction, and that remains the case to this day.
Yeah, and it is especially egregious when they're trying to bring Jesus into the mix, because he was actually a revolutionary that fought against the slave regime of the Roman Empire, and he fought against the very thing that these organized religious institutions imposed. So they imposed this roundabout way of entrenching alienation, entrenching inequality. So this idea of God, the idea of the sort of perverted and entrenched idea of humiliation and alienation, that it is something you cannot do anything about, that you're born to eternally suffer, that you cannot gain peace right now, only in the afterlife. And if you analyze the revolutionary the revolutionary things that Jesus did, such as educating people, organizing, the class struggle in Judea and other parts of the Roman Empire against inequality, against the slaveholders, you will realize that these things that he fought against, these are the very same things that are now supported by these these entrenched religious institutions.
Yeah, and this is a factor that is largely, well, it got buried by the avalanche of propaganda and anti-communism in the 1980s. But the proper Marxist critique of religious institutions has largely been abandoned in the West these days. But to turn back to the question about the process of rebuilding in the socialist period in the Baltic states. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that came about in this period? Because from the reading I've done, there was a good deal of success at rebuilding from the damage of the war. In fact, the rebuild in the Baltic states and the wider Soviet Union was much more successful and moved much quicker than the rebuilding process, even in a country as rich as imperialist Britain did.
Yes, that is true, because as you know, the Soviet Union was immensely damaged by the fascist invasion. The sheer amount of people that were killed by the invaders and the damage that was done to agriculture, done to industry and other parts of the economy, it was immeasurable. And in Latvia alone, more than 200,000 people were abducted for slave labor in Germany by the Nazis. So there was an acute labor shortage. Most of these people managed to successfully return to Latvia, but like I mentioned, more than 500,000 people were killed. So the country was again sparsely populated after this destructive invasion. And immediately, other Soviet countries, despite feeling a lot of hardship themselves, they provided a lot of help to the Baltic countries to initiate this successful rebuild of the economy. For example, in 1945 alone, 85,000 tons of coal, 8,500 tons of kerosene were sent to Latvia by Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asian republics in order to get the economy back on track. All of the damaged power stations, so hydroelectric plants and coal plants, they were immediately rebuilt and reopened. And the economy by 1947, 1948, it almost completely recovered. So it was on par with the 1940 statistics, and productivity was up by 36%. And Latvia by that point was still a mixed economy, because the influence of private property was still very strong, but it was on its track to become a socialist economy. The thing with the Baltic states is that socialism did not exist for very long in these lands. So if you count 1918 and 1919, that's 2 years, and 1940, that's another year. So only 3 years of socialist governments. The rest was capitalism and the imperialist invasion in the 1919 and 1941. So compared to the rest of the Soviet Union, the Baltic countries, they had a lot of catching up to do, not only in terms of the economy, but also in terms of psychology, because that is the slowest thing to advance. That is the slowest thing to change. And when you have decades of brutal nationalist, fascist repression, that certainly leaves a mark. And so the Baltics, they had to undergo a very rapid and very thorough transformation. And as things will later show, unfortunately, this transformation was abruptly ended by Khrushchev and his gang. But let's get back to the economy real quick. So by 1949, the collective farms were completely rebuilt. The amount of crops collected also matched the pre-war levels, and 915 collective farms were formed, and many new towns around these collective farms were opened. So if you go to many of the smaller Latvian towns, these are the towns that were founded by the Soviet government near the collective farms in order to centralize agriculture, to make it more efficient, and to make it much better for the people that live there. Because once it becomes more centralized, you can open schools, you can open libraries, you can open convenience stores for the people, so they don't have to travel to large cities every day to do all of the necessary trade and shopping. And education was also rapidly advancing. So compared to the 1930s, in 1937, you had 3 times as many college and university graduates by the late 1940s, and that was already an immense progress. 10 new feeders were opened in the countryside as well. So by 1949, the Latvian economy it completely rebuilt itself, and it matched or exceeded the levels of 1940. And in 1947, the stamps were abolished. So people did not have to get stamps to buy basic necessities like certain foods, sugar, fuel, etc. So when you compare it to places like France or especially the United Kingdom, where the stamps persisted until the early 1950s, the Soviet Union made immense progress, and even all of these bourgeois and imperialist economists, they were convinced that the Soviet Union would not be able to rebuild until the late 1950s or early 60s, and they were genuinely astonished that the Soviet Union, with its efficient centralized economy, managed to rebuild in just 4 years.
Yes, and whereas I can compare it directly to the rebuilding process in Britain, which is not an unfavorable comparison for the British side, because there was still whole areas of cities that were bombed out in terms of just being reduced to ruins as late as the early 1970s. So areas of Manchester and Liverpool and other major cities were still was scarred by bombed out ruins for 25 years after the end of the war. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the rebuilding process was much more thorough and comprehensive, because not only was there a different class in power there and the economy was organized differently, but in the British case, the bourgeoisie just simply didn't care about rebuilding a lot of working class areas. They just left a lot of them in ruins until it was profitable to actually clear the sites. And as you say, rationing persisted in this country, I think, until the middle of the 1950s. And so the supposed efficiency of capitalism is on full display there from our point of view. So to take this to another level, there, a different level here, you mentioned in your previous comment, comrade, that making the correct analysis of the way that consciousness lags behind material reality. This is an observation that was made by Stalin in his work Anarchism or Socialism, and I think it's one that is very much something which is not nearly as well understood as it should be in Marxist circles to this day. So the struggle against the fascist element, the struggle against all kinds of bourgeois habits in all socialist countries, but especially those that have been scarred by fascism and foreign occupation, such as the Baltic states. This was a process that was not going to be completed inside a decade. In fact, it would probably take a generation of long-term class struggle, an ideological class struggle, for this to be start to be resolved. But it is derailed by Khrushchev. And this is tied into, of course, Khrushchev's supposedly secret speech, which wasn't secret, where he not only denounced Stalin, but it is the beginning, clear and identifiable beginning of a process of the Soviet leadership essentially abandoning all struggle against bourgeois tendencies bit by bit, until, of course, bourgeois tendencies were successfully able to carry through a counter-revolution in the 1980s. But can you talk about how that process affected the Baltic states, and how the pro-capitalist, pro-fascist forces were able to regrow as a result of what in the West is called the Khrushchev Four?
Yeah, so like you said, the process began in full swing in 1956, but obviously it started way earlier. So the likes of Khrushchev, they started plotting way earlier than that, as far back as the 1930s. And after their murder of Joseph Stalin, they could really take over, something that the likes of Trotsky wanted to do. And basically, the dictatorship of the proletariat was overthrown. So the socialist system, the socialist economy, the socialist way of life was so strong that capitalism, the bourgeoisie, so inside the Soviet Union. So it is a very important thing to stress here is that even if the bourgeoisie is defeated once, even if they don't have their properties with them, they still psychologically remain a bourgeois class. And psychologically, they're still the bourgeoisie. It can be the so-called large or imperialist bourgeoisie. It can be the middle bourgeoisie. It can be petty bourgeoisie. But they're still a bourgeois, and because of this lingering bourgeois perverted consciousness, they're still vying to rebuild capitalism in order to take back the means of production and to take complete control over the country. So in the Soviet Union, these remnants they still persisted. They were still very strong. And after the Khrushchev's 20th Congress, the dictatorship of the proletariat was getting aggressively demolished, and the working class and the working peasantry they were getting progressively pushed out of the positions of government. So economic the economic foundation was still socialist. It was still very strong. It was still very viable. But the bourgeoisie were beginning to take over, and it immediately let itself known in the Baltics, where several bourgeois sects within the Communist Party formed that tried to take over the party. The most notable of which is the so-called national communism that was headed by Eduard Berglovs. So there were still a lot of communists by that point in time, and he was expelled from the party in the early 1960s. And the so-called national communist sect, so which were bourgeois agents, they were forced out of the party. And Khrushchev also initiated a mass amnesty for the Nazi collaborators, and most of them managed to return home from Siberia, and they could continue their nationalist propaganda completely unhindered. So this was also a very important fact that led to the restoration of bourgeois consciousness, and which also greatly aided the capitalist restoration in the late 1980s. And the same nationalist elements, the same former bandits, they also kept close ties with the so-called diaspora. So the nationalist collaborators and the Nazis who fled in 1944 and 45, who established themselves in Sweden, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, United States, and Australia, and used the resources provided by imperialism to wage class warfare and to destroy socialism from within, because many of them used the so-called cultural exchange and diaspora trips to get in touch with the local agents here in Soviet Latvia, to reestablish their bases, to reestablish their contacts, to get into the positions of power, and to subvert the socialist governance from within.
So the picture you're painting here is of when what goes on is the leadership of the CPSU, the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself, not only gives up the struggle against these bourgeois tendencies, but releases the very fascists who'd been fighting a war against the Soviet state in the later 1940s. So it lets them go. They not only come back home, but some of them, I've read this from other sources, establish themselves within the local Communist Party as essentially long-term sleeper agents. This is true certainly in Ukraine, where some of these people came out of the woodwork in the later 1980s. So what happens is that the Soviet Party and its Republican elements, so the Republic parties in the Baltic states and Ukraine and elsewhere, these are hollowed out really from the top. So you still have, by the time the 1980s have come around, you have had, and by the time Gorbachev appears on the scene as General Secretary, these pro-capitalist and fascist elements within the party itself have had 30 years almost to establish themselves in positions of authority, both in the party, in the state structure, and in industry. So that by the time Gorbachev arrives, he actually has a strong layer of support that has been built for him, for someone like him, to come along, and all he needs to do is to remove the final elements of proletarian control that are left to usher in a full-blown counter-revolution. Is that a correct summary of how things go from the perspective of the Baltic states?
Yes, correct. And in fact, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and others in their circle, they actually first used the Baltic states as some sort of testing ground to work out how to carry out this complete counter-revolution, and how to set a precedent, how to instigate a counter-revolution that looks like it's progressive, that looks like some sort of liberation, and use that as the sort of foundation onto which you cling onto. You cling onto it and use it to destroy the rest of the Soviet Union. So the Baltics were the first where that would be carried out, and this is a very, very multifaceted topic, because you have both the internal bourgeoisie internally, who are fighting against the socialist governance, and the outside influence of imperialism. So it is very incorrect when a lot of people try to simplify it and try to pin it exclusively, for example, on Gorbachev, or try to pin it exclusively on the Western spies. It doesn't really work like that, and it is the combined influence, the combined pressure of the entirety of the capitalist class. It is class warfare, and but in the 1980s, capitalist imperialism mobilized all of the resources they had available, both abroad and within the Soviet Union, because this was the pivotal time. So it was now or never for imperialism, because their economies were beginning to falter, and if they did not overthrow the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact right now, and use all of their resources to sustain themselves, it would be over. So that is why they started mobilizing in the 1980s. And one more important thing that I want to talk about is the heroic deed of Valery Sablin on November 9th, 1975. A lot of people have surely heard about him, about Valery Sablin.
Is this the Soviet naval commander who tried to essentially restart a revolution by sailing his vessel towards Leningrad? Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's him. And he was actually stationed in Riga when he tried to reestablish the revolution. He tried to address the people of the Soviet Union. So on November 9th, 1975, after the Naval Army Parade, on the anniversary of the October Revolution, Valery Sablin and other seamen on that ship, on Sторozhevoy, it was called. They took over the ship. They arrested all of those who tried to resist, including Sablin's superior, and they tried to get the ship to Leningrad in order to address the country on primetime television and radio. And Valery Sablin was a very educated communist. He was from a family of seamen, of naval officers, and he was also the Zampolit of the ship. So he was the political commissar. And he actually understood very clearly where the country was going. It was a very, very wrong turn of events that transpired in the 1950s and 1960s. And he requested to address the country to tell the following, that the country is looking into the abyss. And if nothing is done, then capitalism will be able to reestablish itself. So basically, Valery Sablin advocated for the reestablishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, for the cultural revolution in order to save the country, because this was truly, like I said, the now or never time for both the socialist system of governments, for the communists, and both their enemies. But unfortunately, the revisionist circles, the bourgeois circles, prevailed. Valery Sablin's ship was shelled, it was fired upon, and it was mobilized. He was arrested, and he was executed. And his comrades were either kicked out of the navy or put into prison. And that is why we cherish Valery Sablin's heroic deed, because even if he could not fully describe it, even if he could not anticipate what would happen, because he was one of the first who tried to restore the country, tried to restore the dictatorship of the proletariat. His deed must never be forgotten, because we must always fight together, and we must not allow such brave people like Valery Sablin get killed by capitalism, because people like him, the brave heroes, the brave partisans of the Great Patriotic Class War, the people like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, people like Sergei Kirov, Iosif Stalin, these are the people that make the dictatorship of the proletariat possible. And if we save their lives, if we cherish their lives, if we educate them so that there will be more people like Stalin, so that every one of us could be like him, then the revolution truly would be undefeatable. So by the 1980s, these counter-revolutionary elements, they became very, very powerful. And a lot of them used the excuse of the diaspora and cultural exchange travel to organize these clandestine groups. And with Gorbachev, several political associations of counter-revolutionaries formed, like the infamous Perestroika Initiative Group, which later became the Lithuanian Nationalist Party of Sąjūdis. The so-called Latvian National Front, the Estonian National Fronts formed. So you can see how they're doing this. They're trying to co-opt this pseudo-revolutionary rhetoric, these pseudo-revolutionary names, in order to trick people into supporting them. So you can see the national fronts. So they hijacked the revolutionary name for the Spanish National Front, for the German, for the French National Front, to try to oust the socialist government. Various Trotskyist and nationalist groups united, and they started publishing pamphlets and literature against the so-called Stalinist excesses. So they're trying to portray socialism as something evil. So they simply use Solzhenitsyn's playbook. So they try to pit communism against freedom. So they try to detach freedom and independence from classes, and then they pit communism against it. So that's how they managed to gradually take over the masses and to convince the masses to support all of these counter-revolutionary groups by the late 1980s.
Yes, and this is what goes on when, of course, the struggle again. Not only is the struggle against bourgeois tendencies abandoned, but the leadership of the Soviet Union by the middle of the 1980s is actively intervening on the side of the reactionary elements. They are actively crippling anybody who tries to resist capitalist restoration, and aiding those who wish to not only restore capitalism but to break up the Soviet state itself. Because studying that period, you can come to no other conclusion than that this is the overall aim, not just of the external reactionaries, but the internal reactionaries as well. And you make a good point, which is that by the early 1980s, in fact, from the middle 70s, Imperialism is in the US and in Britain and the Western European countries is actually in a deep crisis. In order for it to survive, it needed to completely destroy the socialist system. The tragic thing is that had the socialist course prevailed in the Soviet Union and the people's democracies, then the miseries of the last 30 years need not have happened. Across not just in the Baltic states, in the former Soviet countries, but across the world where socialist projects were destroyed. All of this could have been avoided because imperialism has been declining rapidly for many decades now and needed to be able to parasitically feed off the former socialist countries in order to revive itself. But even having revived itself briefly from doing that, it can't stop its exponential decline. And we're witnessing the decline now, but the tragedy is that we're witnessing a decline with very small actual communist forces around, which can take advantage of the situation to embed ourselves further in the working class. And that is the tragedy of the situation we face today. Obviously failing imperialist system with limited forces able to respond to that.
Yes, because as they say, 20 years of hard work will save you 100 years of misery. And if you look at the economic and sociological statistics on the imperialist states and most capitalist states in the world, you will see that they are back to the same level they were in the 1970s and 1980s. So a very deep crisis, a total lack of funds, complete collapse of infrastructure, so extremely high budget deficits and debt. So all of these huge, enormous resources they could exploit and grab from the Soviet Union, from the Warsaw Pact, and a lot of countries in Asia and Africa, they cannot sustain themselves any longer, and which is why we have to be together. We have to work together, because only with the proletarian internationalism we can end this campaign of misery waged by imperialism as quickly as possible. Because if it is possible to save millions, tens of millions of people from this despair, from this misery, from these conflicts, from these wars and death, we should do that as soon as possible. We should do that immediately, because if we do it right now, then imperialism would have even less of a chance of restoration or attempts of restoration in the future. And to get back to the 1980s, several NGOs and institutions like the infamous they started working in the Baltics. They started working in the Baltics in order to subvert the socialist system. And its leader, Gene Sharp, made several visits to the Baltics, actually, and he recruited a lot of people from the Perestroika initiative groups that were active in the Baltic countries. So, for example, he managed to recruit Andrius Butkevičius and Vytautas Landsbergis in Lithuania. And in Latvia, he recruited Talovs Junzis, who became his representative. And that is how the bourgeoisie, both abroad and within the Soviet Union, managed to establish these ties. And the bourgeoisie from many of these republics, so they worked closely together. For example, Yeltsin and Gorbachev made several visits to the Baltics in order to conspire with the local bourgeoisie, because the Baltic bourgeoisie alone, the Baltic capitalist elements alone, they couldn't have done that without the help and facilitation and funding from the capitalist class, from other parts of the Soviet Union and from abroad. And in the 1990s, the bourgeois elements within the communist parties in the Baltics, so Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, they feel emboldened enough to proclaim the bourgeois interwar republics in the place of the Soviet socialist republics. They organize these new sham elections into the Supreme Soviet, and they try to orchestrate coups within the Communist Party in order to transform them into the bourgeois appendix, into the bourgeois political machine. The bourgeoisie succeeded in Lithuania and Estonia, but they failed to do so in Latvia. So during the last Soviet Congress of the Latvian Communist Party, the bourgeois elements failed to gain the necessary amount of votes to transform the party constitution. So instead, what they opted to do a full-blown coup. So in 1990, there was the situation that is described by Lenin as двоевластие, so the presence of two power structures simultaneously. So the socialist structure and the capitalist structure that were existing side by side, but this situation could not continue for long. So at this point, the bourgeoisie in Latvia, they were waiting for the go-ahead signal because they did not have enough strength to completely overthrow the Soviet government, and that came in August of 1991 when GKCP happened. There were a lot of opinions on what it was, how it acted, and how it failed to save the Soviet Union. But a lot of people rightfully believe that it was a provocation. So it was a provocation orchestrated by the bourgeoisie to force the communists into stepping into a very weak position and make them look like the communists, not the bourgeoisie, were trying to orchestrate a coup. And that was used as a formal pretext by the Soviet government that took over the Soviet Union, headed by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, to formally ban the Communist Party and all of its sister parties and other countries, like in the Baltics. And this situation was also used by the Baltic bourgeoisie to proclaim independence, to bypass the Soviet legislation. And it was immediately recognized by Gorbachev. And several people actually tried to prosecute Gorbachev for high treason because he grossly violated the trust of the working class, and he completely bypassed all of the laws of the Soviet land. And he recognized the so-called phony independence of the Baltic states to establish a precedent in order to completely destroy the Soviet Union, so that it could be carved up into 15 separate smaller states that can be fully controlled by capitalism. And the Communist Party in the Baltics, it was immediately banned by the bourgeoisie who came into power. And a lot of the communists, a lot of the Baltic comrades were immediately put into prison. And the newly elected Supreme Soviet, now the bourgeois Supreme Soviet, it immediately reinstated the bourgeois constitutions of the 1920s and 1930s. And in Latvia and Estonia, another egregious thing that they did was to establish the system of apartheid that is very similar to the ones that was present in the South African Union, and the one that is present in the Nazi state of Israel. So what the Estonian and the Latvian bourgeoisie did, they immediately took the citizenship away from roughly 1 million people, 700,000 people in Latvia, 1/3 of the population, and 400,000 in Estonia, 1/3 of the population. Those were affected were the members of the Communist Party, active members of the Communist Youth, and the police and the government, and also most of the ethnic minorities in both countries. So the Russians, the Belarusians, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, and also the Latvians that migrated back to Latvia after the war from Siberia. For example, those people who were living there since the 19th century, they came back to Latvia, and they also had their citizenship stripped away. So this is a system of apartheid that is referred by both regimes as non-citizens, and those people who had their citizenship taken away, they cannot vote or get elected. They cannot become municipal or government workers. They cannot own firearms to defend themselves because unarmed minorities are very easy to exploit and oppress. They also cannot become policemen or rescue workers. They also cannot become attorneys. They cannot practice law at all. And they also cannot establish political parties. And those political parties that do exist, they must have less than half of their card-carrying members as non-citizens. If it's over 50%, then the party is automatically banned. So in total, there are about 80 limitations, 80 statutes that limit the rights of those people subjected to the apartheid system. And also non-citizens, they used to face employment quotas. So they were placed at the very bottom of the pile when filing for employment or applying to a university. And also, non-citizens have severe restrictions on travel, and they cannot travel to a visa without a visa to a lot of places compared to citizens. So the bourgeois regimes of Latvia and Estonia said that only those who lived in the interwar bourgeois republics and their descendants, they could gain citizenship. So the consensuous communists and the ethnic minorities who came to the Baltic countries after the war, they could not gain citizenship. So this is the situation that we find ourselves now. And you can see that this strategy was deliberately chosen to fracture the many ethnicities within the Baltic states, to pit these ethnicities against one another, to fracture the working class again along these manufactured nationalist lines, to fracture the organizational capacity of the working class, to prevent them from getting any sort of representation under this capitalist system, and to prevent a possible socialist uprising. So that's what these discriminatory laws do, and they exist to this day. Under international pressure, they were relaxed somewhat, but they still persist. They still exist, and despite these egregious violations, these barbaric policies, the nationalist regimes of the Baltics rank very high in these phony Freedom House ratings, political freedom ratings, press ratings, even though the real situation on the ground is very, very far from that. And in fact, the Baltic governments that exist right now, they are very, very tyrannical.
Indeed, and the just to go back for a moment, the status of the GAKCP, the State Committee for the what is it, the state of emergency that was declared in August 1991. I think that's even been declared by some Russian sources now as definitively being a provocation. Even somebody like Alexander Rutskoy, who was a collaborator of Yeltsin for a while before falling foul of him later on, declared that the events of August 1991 was a provocation staged by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and that Gorbachev essentially set up some of the participants in that state committee to set them up to deliberately fail, in order that, as you said, the final provocation could be carried through, and then the used as an excuse to dissolve and make illegal the CPSU and to destroy the Soviet Union. And this was very much a deliberate conspiracy. So even former collaborators with Yeltsin and Gorbachev have come out and said that these days. But to draw our conversation to a conclusion, the restoration of capitalism in the Baltic states has been, even just from a cursory examination of the statistics regarding the conditions of life for people in the Baltic states now, the restoration of capitalism has been a complete disaster, because, as you indicated earlier on in our discussion, not only have millions left the Baltic states, the birth rate has collapsed. These countries aren't even producing newborns to the rate of being able to replace the population that dies. So the restoration of capitalism and the coming back of these fascist elements into power in the Baltic states, as it has across the rest of the former Soviet Union, have come close to killing these nations off entirely, doing the work that the Nazis tried to do through brute force. Decaying imperialism has managed to do through class war, demoralization, and atomization of the population. So I want to leave a final word on this to you, comrade, as to how things stand at the moment and the potential for a revival of the socialist tradition today.
Thank you. So, like you said, this is indeed a war, and this is basically the continuation of the fascist policy that was enforced by the Hitlerites. So right now, the forms of warfare changed, and it's more of a silent war, the silent genocide that is waged on the peoples of the Soviet countries and the Warsaw Pact. And it is especially evident in the Baltics because there is a major class fracture that is crossing the Baltics. So we are trapped between imperialism and the fledgling socialist revolution that will happen again. And if you see how the communist revival is going on in places like Belarus, Russia, how socialism is getting more capable in places like the People's Korea and China. And you will see that the Baltics and Ukraine are used as sort of a battering ram by imperialism in order to force this all-out conflict and try to buy themselves just a little bit more time, a little bit more. Like in the Shakespeare play, "Oh, please, oh dear execution, just delay the execution just a little more." So in the Baltic states in the 1990s, the economy it collapsed because immediately, just like in the aftermath of the First World War, the Baltics were cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union by these borders, by border checkpoints and tariffs. So all of these huge industrial giants that present in Latvia. And back then, the Soviet Latvia could produce anything from agriculture to space engineering because we had computer manufacture, we had microprocessor manufacture, we had a very developed pharmaceutical and chemical industry. For example, the now infamous meldonium, the heart medication, it was actually developed here in the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. Latvia also developed and supplied ftorafur, a medication that was supplied to the Japanese radiation victims caused by the barbaric American bombing. So the Latvian pharmaceutical chemical industry, the textile industry, the automotive industry. Latvia produced a lot of heavy and light automobiles that also produced trains, both diesel trains and electrified trains. So the RVR factory was also very famous. So all these photographs where you see Soviet trains, many of them were manufactured here in Latvia. And it was a huge scientific hub because it had a lot of researchers that were engaged in biology, in agricultural selection, and agricultural development. And I also mentioned chemistry and also rocket science. So one of the famous Latvian scientists, Keldysh, he was one of the lead developers of the Soviet nuclear shield. He developed the Soviet nuclear program to defend the socialist motherland against imperialism. So the Baltics overall were very, very forward thinking in terms of science, in terms of development, and they had very, very tightly knit and organized working class that was a great danger to the restored capitalist system. And not only they did introduce the apartheid system, they also destroyed the economy, these large industrial hubs, in order to fracture the working class, to deprive the working class of its base, to try to reinstate this petty bourgeois system so that the working class would not be able to regain its health and to mount a counteroffensive against capitalism. So that's why all of these major enterprises, and I mean all of them, they were deliberately dismantled, they were deliberately bankrupted, and their remains were deliberately sold to the foreign imperialists for pennies on the dollar. For example, one of the prime examples of this is the Riga factory that manufactured glass and windows and glass panes. It was closed in the 1990s. And the reasoning for that was, oh, we can just import the Western manufactured glass for cheap. And what really happened is that without the local competition, the prices on windows and glass panes skyrocketed and rose by more than more than 6 times the original resale value. So a lot of these factories were closed down. The people were forced out of these factories, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed. It was more than 20% in the early 1990s, and the economy plummeted. In 1992 alone, the Latvia's GDP decreased by more than 40%. So it was a complete and total collapse. And this stagnation, this collapse continued throughout the 1990s. And in the 2000s, there was this brief economic revival brought with the capital speculation and banking and real estate. And that all crashed and 2009. So the economy collapsed by 27%, the worst dynamic in the world in 2009, and more than 200,000 people they left Latvia in that year alone. So in total, within these 30 years, Latvia lost almost a million people. So we went through 2.7 million in 1990, and now we're sitting at 1.8 million in 2024. So only officially, we lost almost a million people in total. But experts believe that this figure is actually a lot bigger because this is the inflated figure. We haven't conducted a census in more than 10 years. And a lot of the people who are formally registered in Latvia, they're actually abroad. So they come visit Latvia for only 2 to 3 months every year. But for the rest of the year, they are in the UK, in Ireland, in Germany, and elsewhere, in Norway. But officially, they're still in Latvia. So the real figure could be less than 1.5 million. So, like I said, this is the matter of life and death for the Baltic peoples, because we are already tiny countries to begin with. And this is what actually Lenin referred to as the small country curse. So he said this: desperate or unhappy is the communist who got to be born in a small country. So what he meant is that small countries, it is very hard to fight for the dictatorship of the proletariat alone, because these countries are very small. They have very few people within the country compared to other big countries. And if we try to fight against capitalism alone, then we could be easily crushed by a foreign intervention or the capitalist counteroffensive. So in order for us to survive, in order to save the Baltic countries, in order to save the Soviet countries, in order to save Eastern Europe as a whole, we need proletarian internationalism. We need as much combined work as possible. And if it is possible, then, for example, we should help each other with literature. We should supply ourselves with literature. We should supply ourselves each other with the financial help, with the financial needs as much as possible. We should, for example, hold these meetings as much as possible. We should talk together as much as possible. We should support the strikes in other countries as much as possible. We should support the class struggle as much as possible. We should unmask this capitalist imperialist propaganda as much as possible. And we should fight together as much as possible, because only this thing can bring about the victory in this, and it can save us from the imperialist aggression, from the imperialist destruction, and the complete eradication of the Baltic peoples. This is the imperialists want to do. They want to destroy humanity. They want to destroy our culture. They want to destroy our lives, and we must not let them. And right now we are entering a pivotal moment, because right now imperialism is becoming more and more vulnerable, and we must use that to finally mount a counteroffensive, because many smaller countries in Europe, in Asia, otherwise, they do not have much time. Because, like I said, we must strive to save as many people as possible everywhere. We must fight for the Palestinians. We must fight for the Africans. We must fight for the peoples in Asia, in Europe, in North America, in South America, everywhere we can. Because only with the combined offensive, only that way we can defeat imperialism. And we must save our comrades. We must help them as much as possible in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Russia, in the UK, in France, elsewhere, everywhere we can. Because even the smallest step forward, even the smallest act of help, of kindness, of proletarian internationalism, it goes a long way. And like I said, like our comrades in Russia say, 20 years of hard work, they replace 100 years of torment.
I mean, that is an excellent point to make and to conclude our discussion for today. Comrade Iskolat, I thank you for the very extensive exposition and explanation of the history of the struggle for socialism, revolution and counter-revolution in Latvia and the other Baltic states today. And I encourage all listeners to listen to both parts of this interview. You will come away with a very comprehensive rebuttal that you will be able to make to the usual talking points about the Baltic states and the socialist period. We will also link to the variety of reading materials that Comrade Iskolat has suggested to us so that comrades can do their own independent reading on this matter. It only remains for me to say thank you to you, Comrade, for your time over the past two interviews, and to encourage everybody to follow you on Twitter and to find out more about the socialist period in Baltic history. But I will conclude by thanking you again and hoping that in some point in the future you can join us again for further discussions.
Thank you very much. So if you have, dear listeners, dear comrades, have any more questions, so feel free to ask us for more contact information, for more contacts, for more reading materials, and for more resources on the matter. So the class struggle in the Baltics and Eastern Europe as a whole, some interesting books, brochures that we have, because we're already trying to establish a book digitalization effort. So most of these books, most of these materials, they are not available online. Most of them we have only as a physical copy, and many of them could be lost forever. So to prevent that from happening, we're undertaking these steps to digitize them, to spread these books online on websites such as archive.com and elsewhere. So thank you again. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I really hope to speak to you again. And like I said, only with combined worldwide struggle we can win this fight. So thank you very much. And Rock Front, solidarity forever, comrade.